I'm not going to take any more of his time. Come preach to us about burning the fire, keeping the fire burning our marriages.
Well, good afternoon. All right, let's see if, I know this time of day, you've had a couple of sessions, it's after lunch, kind of getting tired, so I don't know if we need to sing I'm Alive, Awake, Enthusiastic, or do some aerobics, or I'm trying to scan the audience and see where Cliff is, because Cliff mentioned a whole lot in that last lesson about his skills in hurting people. And just for the record, Cliff is my favorite preacher in the world, wherever he's at. So it's really bad because I'm fixing to preach on marriage, and as much as Cliff tried to give you the disclaimer that there's no such thing as a perfect parent and he's not up here because he was a perfect parent, I can promise you I'm not up here because I'm a perfect husband, nor because I have figured it all out. I'm afraid that because of the certain set of skills that Cliff has, my wife may after this session hire him to do some work on me. I don't know. But I am expecting a lot of amens from a really pretty woman in an orange shirt back there and looking at me like, okay, so you know you're supposed to do it. Now you're out with that excuse. So I don't know where we'll land. But I'm thankful to get to study this type of thing because it means so much to me. I just got through was it 2 weekends ago, I guess, Melody? There's a young couple at our congregation. I did their premarital counseling for them, which when you do people ask, will you do our wedding and do our counseling? I'm like, yeah, but you need to know what you're signing up for with premarital counseling with me, because it's not we're going to come watch a video for one night, and this is an extensive course, and you're going to have homework that you're going to do. And if you show up for a session and you haven't done your homework, we don't have that session. And they're like, and there's some couples that are like, yeah, we forgot to do it, but we knew you were kidding. I'm like, nope, see you next week, and it's just too important. But anyway, we get to the end of our counseling session, and Shelley and Isaac are their names, and they're thanking me this last session for doing the counseling with them, and that I was going to do their wedding that Saturday coming up. And I told them, I said, I'm thanking you for letting me do it. And number one, it's an honor for someone to ask you to do something like that. It's such a special moment in their life. But number two, because I need to study that. And it reminds me, in almost every session that we have, I would study with them for an hour and talk about what it means to be the kind of husband and wife that God wants us to be. And then I go home, I give them an assignment to work on, and my assignment is always to go home and tell Melody, I'm sorry. And she'll say, for what? Well, tonight we studied A, B, and C, and I just realized how terrible that I am at all that. And she says, because she's a good woman, she'll say, oh, no, you're not. And kind of like whenever our kids fall down and they say, I'm clumsy. And she'll say, oh, no, you're not, but our kids are clumsy. And so I know what that means when she says, oh, no, you're not, So I can't tell you a lot I can tell you what the Bible says about some things, and I can give you some hints and suggestions. I love to study this because I'm always trying to be a better husband. Also because it's one of the areas that we do not do enough in the Lord's church with. We wonder why so many homes fall apart, why so many marriages end in divorce, why so many marriages are not what they should be. And again, we'll just be real honest and upfront with all this. If we spend as much money, time, talent, and energy on marriages as we do weddings, it would fundamentally change everything in our society. The wedding lasts 2 hours. The marriage is supposed to last a lifetime. So why don't we spend more time encouraging that and helping with that? And part of the problem, I told Bob I could just get up here and say everything that Cliff said, change the direct object from parents to spouse, and we're done. Because it's basically the same thing. But part of it is we're so ashamed. We don't want to be real with each other. We don't want to really talk about our problems. We don't want to mentor and help each other. But we've got to get over that, because the reason why that our society and culture is what it is because the home is not what it should be. And the reason why the church is not so often the way that it should be is because the home is not what it should be. And the home is not what it should be because the marriage is not what it's supposed to be. And I need to start off by telling you this as well, that sometimes when we talk about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, and I'm specifically talking preachers, elders, Bible class teachers, when we do get around to preaching or teaching about divorce, remarriage, that's all we talk about is marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And we preach the truth, and we tell people that when you marry, when it's one man and one woman for life. And we talk about how that you're supposed to, as long as your spouse is living, be faithful only to your spouse. And the only way in God's sight that it can end honorably is by death. And the only exception for the divorce and remarriage clause is if you're the innocent party when fornication, sexual immorality is taking place. And so we hammer this point into our young people, their minds, to our young married couples, their minds, that God's vision for marriage is that you get married and just don't get divorced. And there's a whole lot more that God wants for our marriages and our homes than just don't get divorced. When He says to enjoy the wife of your youth, that doesn't mean just don't get divorced. When He shows how much He appreciates and loves that couple, that relationship between a husband and a wife, by the way that He uses it, not only in the places that He went, but in the things that He illustrated with it. It's more than just don't get divorced. And we need to understand that and appreciate that. But the problem is that we sometimes get negligent on our marriages. It becomes too easy to, well, we'll work on that later. There's something else going on. We'll decide that later. We'll fix that problem later, and just kick the can down the road. And suddenly you realize, I'm not sure who we are. I'm not sure who I'm married to. I'm not sure where we go from here. It's interesting because we'll talk about a lot. I'll refer occasionally back to the Song of Songs. And by the way, I can say like Cliff did, I had them put the slides on there, and I think it was 97 slides. And when that pops up, they don't have to say anything. You can see the person in the sound booth go, and how long are we, I told them, I said, I'll go really fast. Lots of bullet points, but what I've done basically the last 3 weeks is I practiced this sermon, and it's way too long, and I cut some stuff out that I like. So I've got handouts here with some stuff that I had to cut out, that I didn't like that I had to cut out, but I had to cut out. And also we may end up going through some of this rather quickly, and you won't have time to write it down. I'd rather you not write it down and just take the notes and just us talk about this for a minute, okay? Because it's really important that you understand and get this. And I don't care if you've been married 6 months or 60 years. There's things that we can all do better in our marriages, and things that we can do better in the way that we treat our spouses. Understanding how important it is. Brett preached 2 hours ago about Psalms. Last hour, Cliff mentioned a lot of Proverbs. We're going to talk about the Song of Songs a little bit, especially in our introduction. And so Ecclesiastes and Job is still up for grabs if any of the speakers are looking for material. But we're going to cover a lot of the wisdom literature this afternoon, evidently. But the Song of Songs is where I want to begin, because marital problems is not something that's just happened in our society. It's not something that's just happened in our culture. It's something that has always existed, and it's something that God has wanted us to understand. In Song of Songs, and sometimes you'll hear it called Song of Solomon, but Song of Songs is the name that the book gives itself in the opening verses, and that just really means this is the best song that there's ever been. I don't know if Casey Kasem was still doing the top 40 in the days of Solomon, but if he did, this was the #1 record that they would count down to each weekend. And some of the young people are going, Casey, who? But you can find out later. It's the best song ever. And at the end of the psalm, this is what he says. Set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm, for love is strong as death, jealousy is fierce as the grave. Its flashes are flashes of fire, the very flame of the Lord. Now, when we see jealousy, we automatically think negative. There's good jealousy. God's jealous of us. I want my wife to be jealous of me to a certain point. If she sees me flirting with another woman or another woman flirting with her, I hope she doesn't say, well, maybe that means I won't have to put up with him much longer. I'm hoping she has. But this word not only is sometimes translated jealousy, but the word is also sometimes translated as zeal. It means that you're, how we define zeal, on fire. You're on fire for your spouse. That you have that marriage relationship and who that person is, that they mean everything to you. Of all the relationships that you have, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in just a minute, but of all the relationships you have, the number one relationship you have is Jesus. And second to that is the relationship, if you're married, with your spouse. The most important decision you'll ever make in your life is to follow Jesus. The second most important decision you'll ever make is who you're going to marry. And here's why, among a host of other reasons. Because the one decision you make that will affect that first decision more than any other decision is who you choose to marry. We're talking about not just 50 years of happiness or unhappiness here in this life. We're talking about potentially changing the course of our eternity. That's how important that this relationship is. And at the end of the lesson, I'll tell you a little bit more about why it's so important as well. But in the Song of Songs, you have the first 3 chapters basically. You've got the courtship that goes on between Solomon and this Shunammite woman. And then you have the marriage ceremony in chapter 4. And then you get to then in chapter 3. And then in chapter 4, you've got the marriage ceremony right before, somewhere in between chapter 3 and chapter 4. We don't really see the marriage ceremony. But at the beginning of chapter 4, you've got the honeymoon begins. And you remember that, don't you? None of you are smiling. Maybe we need to have some honeymoon counseling. I don't know. The honeymoon was supposed to be really happy, right? No. Let me ask again. Do you remember your honeymoon? Yeah, a lot of wives doing this and going, you smile whether you mean it or not, So, the honeymoon. And so you get chapter 4 and he gives this description of her body. And he goes really head to toe. Talking about all the things about, and that's something that is good for us to do, to recognize the attraction that we have for our spouse and those kind of things. Now guys, I wouldn't necessarily recommend you use any of his descriptions. If you tell your wife that she has a neck like a tower, it may not mean the same to her as it did to Solomon's bride, okay? If you tell her that she reminds you of the beautiful Egyptian horses, she's probably not going to take that as a compliment, okay? But you have to put it in their time period, and in their time period, that was a great compliment. That's a whole other subject. So anyway, make sure that you do it in a kind way, but he gives this description of her body and how much that he is attracted to her. And so she follows that with an invitation for him to come into her garden. That's code for, by the way, I love the fact that Brett's here because I love Brett. He's a good preacher. We're close friends. I love the fact that he's taken the children out of the room. So I wondered from the get-go whether this was supposed to be the PG or the PG-13 version. But that code language for coming to my garden is to keep it PG instead of PG-13. She's inviting him to make love to her. And so he says, okay. And they make love. And all of the honeymoon scene is so wonderful, and they're getting along with each other, and they love each other, and they're attracted to each other. And then you get to chapter 5 and 6, and suddenly she's describing this dream that she has. Now some think it's a dream, some think that it was a reality that she's conveying in dream-like form, but the idea that's behind this is I can't find my spouse. We've had a spat, and now he's somewhere else. And there's this separation. There's problems in the marriage. There's trouble in paradise. And the rest of the book is about them trying to find each other, and then them finding each other, and they're reaffirming their love for each other, and they're making love with each other. And then the last chapter is all of these descriptions about how much they care about each other and what it means to each other. What they're saying is that the fire had kind of gone out a little bit. Now, if Solomon, the wisest man that ever lived, by inspiration of God, can say, in my marriage, and we can talk a lot about Solomon and his marriage choices later, but if all of that in God's Word, it can say something about the fact that a man of God can admit there's trouble in paradise, there's problems in the marriage, can we not be grown up enough to admit that our marriage is not perfect? That it could use some work? I love that everybody that has introduced me so far has talked about my love for the Lord and my love for my wife and my love for my boys, and all that's true. And I put stuff on Facebook, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second, about them because I love them. But so much of it is, you remember what Bob said the other day, the difference in image and reputation is? My image of the kind of husband I am is not very good. My reputation is better than my image. I'm trying to live up to a reputation that I don't deserve when it comes to husband category, or daddy category, or man of God category for that matter. We need to understand the need to be honest and real about where we are in our marriages, and understand the reality helps us to realize the necessity of doing some work. And so that's what we want to do this evening. Now, I need to give credit to some people. Here's some of the books that I read books all the time on marriage and fatherhood and that kind of thing. And some of these are books that are some of my favorites. 10 Ways to a Stronger Marriage by Trey and Leah Morgan. If you don't know who they are, they have a great book, but they also have a podcast. They're on social media. They do marriage seminars everywhere. They are top-notch, wonderful. You need to be listening to their podcast. I will tell you that it's sometimes PG-13 because guess what? The Bible sometimes is R-rated. So, you need to understand that and maybe not have the kiddos around while you're doing that. But Real Life Marriage by Tim and Ann Evans. The Love Dare is based on the movie that had Kirk Cameron in it, and it's got different things you can do. 52 Simple Ways to Say I Love You. There's a ton of these kinds of books. I'm not sure who authored this one, but there's a ton of these kind of books that are really good to just give you out. You can say, well, I'm not very romantic. Well, that's an excuse, and you can work on it, and these kind of books will help you with that. Do Yourself a Favor, Love Your Wife. Not only do I love that book, I really love that title. Why should I love my wife? Well, it's the best thing you'll ever do for yourself. So even if you're just really a selfish guy, the best thing you can do for yourself is to love your wife. So he'll talk about that it needs to come out of more than just not jealousy. But Christ in the Home by Robert R. Taylor Jr. covers a lot of relationships in the home, not just marriage. Date Your Wife by Justin Buzzard, and Soulmates by Wayne and Tammy Roberts. Of course, y'all know Wayne and Tammy. Y'all have connections with them, and I don't know, they've probably done, I would guess, his shoes, her shoes up here. They have a book now that has a lot of that same material in it. And that top book and that bottom book are two books that I buy for every couple that I do their marriage ceremony or I do their marriage counseling for, and require them to read it. That's how good the material is, and that's how important that this is. So a lot of this I'm getting from them and some of their study and research. So just understand that there's lots of material out there. What if I told you that I could give you one verse that would cure every marital problem? And some of you are saying that would be convenient. And some of you are saying that means we could go to supper early. And what if I told you I could give you one verse that would cure every marital problem? Would you be interested in knowing what that verse is? Yes? This is yes, and this is no. If you fall asleep, I'm going to start all over. You want to know the verse? 1 Corinthians 7:1. It's not good for men to get married. Now, you laugh, but here's the point. The only way you can stop marital problems is for men not to get married. If you get married, there's going to be problems. There's going to be issues. There's going to be troubles. And I don't say that to make fun of marriage. I love being married, and I'm thankful for my wife. I'm saying that if we get married, you can just assume, the problem is that we have like Disney movies and all of these kinds of things. The Hallmark movies. Have you ever seen any of the Hallmark movies? I saw one the other day where there was a guy that lived in the city, and he went to visit a girl who lived in the country, and the guy really hated Christmas, and she really loved Christmas. Have you seen that one? Y'all have seen that one? And then there's the moment where, they're decorating the tree and she falls off the ladder and he catches her, and then they look at each other and they do this kind of number. I don't know what that... And they almost kiss, but they can't kiss till the end of the movie when it starts to snow. That's how all of that works. And everything is wonderful and beautiful and romantic. And then the credits roll and you're like, I want to live happily ever after. And then we get married at the Greenfield Church of Christ in Greenfield, Tennessee. And my princess, we go to Disney World for our honeymoon, which I'd never been to Disney World. I'm thinking the Dumbo ride. She says, I want to go to Disney World for the honeymoon. And I'm thinking, your idea of a honeymoon and my idea of a honeymoon is way different. I'm not thinking it's a small world is what Anyway, we're thinking everything is wonderful. And then we get back and we go to Walmart to buy all the stuff that you need that you don't get in your showers, And we're walking through there and Melody's putting stuff in the buggy and she grabs a rolling pin and puts it in there. And I take the rolling pin out and set it back. And she said, what did you do that for? I said, we don't need a rolling pin. She said, oh, yes, we do. I said, rolling pins are used on two things, biscuits and husbands, and you've already told me you don't know how to make biscuits. That was the first clue that everything may not be happily ever after, For real, in Proverbs, one of my favorites, where there are no oxen, the manger is clean. Now, if you've ever had to muck some stalls before, clean out a barn, clean out a horse trailer, even worse, clean out a hog trailer before, you know what a dirty... There's a television show dedicated to dirty jobs. That's a dirty job. And sometimes you think, man, I wish I didn't have to do this. Well, there's one way you don't have to do that. Don't have hogs. Don't have horses. Don't have oxen, and you don't have to worry about it. But the problem is then you don't have hogs. And then you don't have horses. And you don't have oxen. He says, but abundant crops come by the strength of the ox. So here's your choice. You can either live without the ox and you won't have anything to clean up, or you can have what the wonderful fruit of having the ox is, but you know that it means you're going to have to do some side work that sometimes is messy and sometimes is stinky, and that's the way marriage is. And you're thinking, we just got a guy to preach to us about marriage that's comparing marriage to cleaning out poo from a barn. Understand the point I'm trying to make is that there's some dirty, difficult tasks in marriage. But it's worth it to get the sweet fruit that it provides. Now, I can't see the clock either, so I'm just going to preach till I get tired, and I don't usually get tired. So I want you to buckle up your seat belts, because I've drank about 4 cups of coffee this afternoon, and we are going to try to go through what I think are important concepts for us to get. The idea that I want you to remember today is that your spouse is worth pursuing. And you knew that at one time, right? Because, guys, you saw her across the hall at school, or you saw her at the gym at a ball game, or you saw her uptown riding around, or with your friends, or whatever, and you said, I want to go out with her. And she looked at you and said, now there's a handsome devil. Or in the case of our marriage, I jokingly tell people the first night that I met Melody, I came home and told my mom and daddy I was going to marry her. And Mama got excited, and I said, well, now, wait a minute, I got to talk her into it now. And that took another year and 9 months, but anyway. And you held the door open for her, and you bought her flowers, and you wrote her poems, and you did all this sweet stuff that you didn't want any of your buddies to find out you were doing, right? Because you were pursuing her. And you didn't dare come downstairs for the date until your hair was so-so and your makeup was so-and-so. Don't let him see me like this, because you're pursuing him. And then we get married and we just don't care. Let's be honest. And don't get me wrong, there's a warm feeling of knowing that I don't have to pretend. I can be whoever I am and Melody's going to love me. I like the fact that we can sit around in short, I'm in short, she's in sweatsuits and 4 quilts on top of, and watch movies, together. And we don't have to, but at the same time, sometimes we get so comfortable we forget to pursue our spouse anymore. And fundamentally, and I know I'm going to use some stereotypes, and if this doesn't apply to you or your spouse or whatever, don't be mad at me, but understand these are just stereotypes are what they are, because typically this is the case. Typical situations, what every guy wants is a cheerleader. He wants someone that's going to brag on him, that's going to encourage him, that's going to build up his ego, because all of us guys have egos. He wants someone that's going to be the rah-rah person for what he does. And every woman wants a knight in shining armor who's going to protect her, who's going to make her feel special, who's going to put her on a pedestal, who's going to provide for her and care for her. And if that doesn't fit you, maybe you're right the opposite. That's fine, but just understand there's certain fundamental needs and desires that we have. And we try to meet those when we're trying to get a spouse, but once we get a spouse, we forget all about them. Your spouse is worth pursuing. And we're going to talk about, it's not just about when you think about the spark or the fire in the relationship. Maybe you start thinking down the PG-13 road. We'll get there eventually. But I want us to talk about 3 specific areas in your marriage that your spouse is worth pursuing today. First of all, your spouse is worth pursuing spiritually. Your spouse is worth pursuing spiritually. She's not only your wife, she's your sister. He's not only your husband, he's your brother. And I know maybe some of you are in marriages where that's not the case, but that's the goal that you have at least. When it comes right down to it, we understand this and we get this, but it gets lost sometimes in translation of our lives. The most important things that we do are those things that are based in eternity. And our marriage isn't necessarily based in eternity. When death comes, that's going to separate that union. But it won't separate the fact that she and I are both part of God's family, and I don't have any desire to live 50 years on this earth with somebody that I'm not going to see in eternity. So my goal, guys, we like to walk around and say, well, I'm the head of the household, And I don't know why we have to use that voice when we say it, but we're Buzz Lightyearing it a little bit. But are you the spiritual head of your household? Is your goal to make your marriage meet your needs, or is your goal to make your marriage meet His needs? Is your goal to get what you can out of your spouse, or is your goal to get your spouse to eternity? That's your job, men. Provide and protect in all. I provide for my home. What about spiritually? What are you doing to provide for your spouse? And wives, the same for you. What are you doing to help your husband be a man of God? For years I worked in development at Bear Valley, and I would talk to guys all the time that want to go into ministry, that want to be preachers, and I'm sure it's probably the same way with Sunset or any other school of preaching that's out there. The number one difficulty that we have in getting guys to commit to ministry is when my wife don't want to. You ever tried to appoint an eldership in your congregation and you've got men that are willing, but my wife won't let me? Are you holding your husband back from being what God needs him to be in His kingdom, or are you encouraging that? That's important. So when are you going to need this spiritual intimacy? Well, there's lots of times. In times of illness, when you get a diagnosis, one or the other, you're going to need some spiritual intimacy. We found out, it's been, I don't know, Melody, she'll correct all the stories I mess up later on, but it's probably been 10, now she's got this look like, what is he fixing to tell? About 10 years ago, maybe, Melody had this spot on her back that looked a little funny. And I said, maybe you should go get that checked out. And she said, it'll be fine. And when we go back home to Tennessee, I'll go to my doctor. And we did. And she said, don't worry about it. I see cancer stuff, all that's not it. And then our doctor, who I grew up going to church with her family, she calls and she's crying because I told you wrong. The lab in Jackson said it's the most unusual melanoma that they've ever seen. Well, I've heard of melanoma, but I didn't know what it was. It's kind of a fun word to say, melanoma, you know. So I thought, well, I'll just look up what that is, which is the worst thing you can do. And I find out what the survival rate for melanoma is. And I find out what possibilities that might lead for us. And that pray without ceasing verse, when you get a diagnosis, nobody has to remind you of that verse, because you pray without ceasing. And I would hold my wife and my boys' hands, and they were much smaller then, and we would pray that Mama's going to be okay. And we put on a brave face, and they would go to bed. And then I would hold my wife's hands while she's in tears. And she's telling me, I know where I'm going if I die, but I've got a husband I want to grow old with, and boys I want to raise. And I would hold her hand, and we would pray, and I'd say, everything's going to be okay. And then she'd go to bed, and I'd get on my knees, and I'd cry, and I'd say, Lord, why are you doing this? That spiritual intimacy that we had in sharing those prayers together. You need that in times of illness. You need that in times of a death of a loved one. I was a pallbearer at one of my closest uncles that I had. First deer I ever shot, he was sitting in the deer stand with me on a juvenile hunt while my daddy was with my brother in his stand. And I'm serving as a pallbearer, and we get done with our duties at the graveside, and I back off to the side, and I'm just feeling really sad. And suddenly I feel a hand on my back. And it's my wife. And I'm filled with warmth. And I don't know why that did that, but it did. With children, he just talked about it in the last hour. If you're not praying without ceasing, have some children. That'll cause you to pray without ceasing. And every time we get to another level where I'm like, whew, then something comes up again where it's like, hey, Daddy, have you ever heard? Oh, no, what are we doing now? So there's all of that, and you need to be a spiritual team when it comes to those things. In disagreements, and you are going to have disagreements. But, you know, one of the things, we'll talk about it, I'll say that. Disagreements, you're going to need that spiritual intimacy. We'll talk about it more in just a minute. In your career and moves, when you have ups and downs in life, when you're going through struggles, when you're going through good times, you need that spiritual intimacy. Opportunities to serve. I talked about a few minutes ago, preachers, elders. You got to have those wives behind you. Women teaching in classes and being involved in the ways they can, and that you need a husband that's supporting you and encouraging you in that. So how do I pursue my spouse spiritually? Well, with all of these, I'll give you a few suggestions, and we'll go through them rather hurriedly, and some I'll stop and talk about. But pursue Jesus more than your marriage is one we need to talk about for just a couple of seconds. Remember, that most important relationship is not your spouse. It's the Lord. And it settles so many things off the bat. There's so many, because I know that my wife loves Jesus more than me, I know that I don't have to worry when I see her talking to another man. I know that there's a good chance she's talking to him about Jesus. And if he has any other ulterior motives, then she's especially going to tell him about Jesus. And maybe how many shotguns I own. I don't know, but it settles so many things. When we go on vacation, we know, Cliff talked about that consistency. We know where we're going to be Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, no matter where we are. We know there's certain movies we're not going to watch. We know there's a lot of movies we're going to watch with Clear Play or VidAngel. So if I use a movie cite a quote or something, and you say, what's he doing watching that movie? Well, it's because we filtered them. And sometimes I forget to tell people that, but all of that is already settled. Pursue Jesus more than your marriage, and it takes care of a lot of these things. Worship together. Make sure that's a priority for you and your spouse. Pray with each other. I talked about a few minutes ago about disagreements and the need for spiritual intimacy. And there's going to be those problems that comes up. But you know what I have found more than anything that will solve a disagreement or a problem in our marriage? And some of you are thinking, say I'm sorry. No, that helps a lot. But the thing that really helps me the most is if I can make myself do it, no matter how upset or angry she or I may be. These couples get really uncomfortable right now. If I grab her hand and say, can we just pray together? You know it's hard to be mad at somebody that says, can I pray with you? Sometimes I'm the one that's upset. Melody will say, maybe we should pray about this. And I'm like, why does she have to bring Jesus into it when I'm upset, you know? You need to pray with each other. There's something powerful about that. I was talking with a preacher just the other day, and he was talking about how that one morning he got up early, and he came downstairs, and he thought he was kind of creeping along because he thought that maybe his wife sometimes would go downstairs and couldn't sleep at night and fall asleep on the couch, and thought that was probably the case. But she was already up, and she was praying, and he said, I heard her pray for me. And he was tearing up. And he said, I can't tell you how wonderful that was. When you're praying together, when you're involved in that together, there's a deeper intimacy that's so important. Serve together. The Lord and His church and other people. Make sure you do that. Study together. Maybe you need some solo Bible study at times and some devotional time on your own, but make sure that you find a way that you can study together. Because my hours are so weird with what all I do, sometimes that's hard for us, but one of the things that I do every day is I write a little devotional and I send it to my wife and I send it to my boys, and now I'm sending it to the girls that my boys are dating because they may be the mothers of my grandchildren one day, and I want to make sure they know something about Jesus along the way. But you need to find ways that you can study together. Fast together. That's one of those, we don't like to talk about fasting, right? I'm especially concerned about this congregation in this area because all I've seen is food since I've been here. And I don't know how much fat, maybe you fast the other 51 weeks, I don't know. But fasting is something that builds discipline. It's something that gives you some extra time to serve the Lord and those kinds of things. And this is not a lesson on fasting. But when you do something like that, a spiritual discipline together, it draws you closer. Listen to sermons and podcasts together that are spiritually minded things. Do that not just when you're at church services, you're assembled with it, but download some sermons and listen in the car or while you're walking together or before you go to bed or whatever it might be. Mentorship. If you're a young couple, find you an older couple that you know has a good, as much as you can know, has a good marriage, and ask them, can you mentor us for the next year? And then when you get to be one of those old couples, which we've now become, I suppose, but make sure that you find a younger couple that's just been married or recently married and say, hey, can we mentor you in your marriage? And maybe that's just getting together once a month and having dinner and talking about the things that are going on in your life. And they say, yeah, I remember in year 2 when we had that problem, right, Gladys? And Gladys will say, yeah, George, that's the problems that we had. And here's how that we took care of that. But those are all things that you can do. Now here's the challenge for you when it comes to pursuing your spouse spiritually. Practice praying together. I'm giving you a lot of suggestions, but I'm going to give you one on each of these that I really want you to, just this week, put into practice. Start praying together. Hold each other's hands before you go to bed, when you get up in the morning, whatever it might be, and just pray together. And see if that doesn't bring you closer to each other and to the Lord. Pursue your spouse, not only spiritually, but pursue your spouse emotionally. It's so important for us to realize the connection that we need to make emotionally with our spouse and figure out some ways that we can do that. We need to increase intimacy. One of the problems in marriages today is that we need to have real intimacy. And when we think about intimacy, oftentimes we think about sex, but intimacy is not just about sex. You know, one of the things that has been a problem coming out of the pandemic is how many marriages suffered. Well, you're spending more time with your spouse. Isn't that a good thing? Not if you don't really like each other. That was the problem with lots of marriages, is they didn't really have a real relationship. They were roommates that shared a budget. They shared kids. They shared a mailbox. They shared names. But they never shared their lives with each other. Who they were with each other. And when they're suddenly thrown together, then there's all of these problems that we see. You know, when you're dating, you look over those things. But now they're just like, oh man, it just amplified all of these things that she does. It just drives me wild. And he, you know, all of those kinds of things that didn't bother us when we really weren't invested in each other. I don't know if you've read the book Love Languages by Dr. Gary Chapman, you need to, if you haven't read that book as a couple, you need to read that book, because what we do sometimes is we try to connect with our spouse emotionally or romantically, and we're trying to help them see how much we love them, but we're doing it in the wrong way. Dr. Chapman has identified these different love languages, like words of affirmation, the kind things you say to each other, spending quality time with each other, where it's just me and her on dates or trips or whatever it might be. Gifts might be a way that you could show someone that you love them, or acts of service, doing something for them, or maybe touch, and not just sex, but holding hands, kissing, hugging, whatever it might be. And the problem arises when, like for me, my gifts, the way that I view love, how I feel loved, is words of affirmation. I love it whenever Bob Turner will say, I love Corey. So that just makes me feel so good, because I love Bob. And to hear that he loves me back makes me feel good. Yeah, I love words of affirmation. If you really want me to do something for you, you can butter me up and I'll do it, whatever it is you need, you know. The other thing is touch. Bob mentioned earlier, some of you are not huggers. Well, stick around with me and I'll train you how to do it, because and if you're a hugger, we've been through 2 years where everybody said stay 6 feet away from each other. And I'm like, okay, you know, and it just hurt me not to hug people. The last sermon I preached at Bear Valley before we moved back to Tennessee, there was a COVID scare. We had a couple of members that had tested positive, and so we were supposed to be all there together, but we weren't. It was me and 2 of our elders that broadcast the service at Bear Valley that week. And it's my last sermon before we moved back to Tennessee, and I preached the sermon, and the elders are standing about from me to you, and they're talking about, man, we're going to miss you, and we love you. And one of them says, oh, come here, you know, and we hug, you know. Well, that's me. So I'm building Melody up, and I'm bragging on her, and I'm rubbing her back and hugging her and kissing her and all of this. And meanwhile, what I don't know is that Melody's love language is acts of service. This is kind of depressing to me. She'd rather me vacuum the floor than smooch on her, you know. So you can't think of it that way, okay? Try not to think of it that way, but that's really what it is. And so if anyone knows a good counselor, I'd love to know Anyway, you need to make sure that you know your spouse's love language and your love language, so you can show her love in the way that he wants to. So how do I pursue my spouse emotionally? Number 1, silence the electronics. Man, it's so depressing to me when I go out to eat and I see a couple on date night and both of them are looking at their phones. And I'm like, you know, there's a beautiful woman right across the table from you. Did you realize that? We need to silence the electronics. Get you a basket and put it there by the front door, and put your phones there, and turn the ringer up, and go about your life. Don't just look at, I've seen couples literally talking to each other on Facebook when they're sitting across the table from each other. And I'm like, you know, you can just cut out the middleman and just, you know, silence the electronics. Number 2, be emotionally available, which means you're going to have to be in tune with your spouse. Make sure that they know that they've got your ear, they've got your eyes, they've got your heart. When there's something that is troubling them, make sure they know that they can talk to you about it. Put together a fun list. You've heard of older people putting together a bucket list. Put together a fun list of, in our marriage, whether you think you have 20 years left in your life or 70 years left or whatever, these are the things that I want us to do together. And try to accomplish those things. Seek a balance between self-help and couple help. In other words, you need to read some books about how to be a better husband. You need to read some books, ladies, about how to be a better wife, but also read some books together about how to be a better couple. Consider marriage enrichment activities. Go on a marriage retreat. Go to some sort of vacation or just one-on-one. That's one of the things that we did. Cliff's talking about bringing his children when he goes to lectureships, and I do that sometimes. Sometimes I leave the kids at home and just bring my wife, and we have a good time together. Sometimes we forget that, and then halfway through the trip we're like, you know, I really like spending time with you, and it's just me and you, you know. So you need that to have those times to realize that. Be strategically vulnerable to earn their trust. What do I mean? I mean, don't just regurgitate every emotion or problem that you have. Don't make them become the sounding board of everything negative in your life. But but at some point make sure that they know that you're being emotionally honest with them. Give your spouse daily affirmations and compliments. Make an effort to break out of your day-to-day routine. But just start by you two reading the book and taking the love language test together and know how to emotionally pursue each other. Pursue each other spiritually, pursue each other emotionally, and finally, pursue each other physically. 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 2, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. Verse 3, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. Verse 4, for the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Verse 5, do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Hebrews 13 verse 4, let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. The Bible talks a lot about sex, and it talks about the bad things, but it also talks about the good things. And the reason He's given us marriage, and the reason He's given us these feelings, and the reason He's given us these desires is because it's a wonderful and beautiful thing. It's what Song of Songs is all about. The beauty of married love. And we need to understand that it's something we need to get comfortable preaching about and teaching about and talking about, because when we don't talk about it, we let the world frame the conversation, and the world doesn't go by these standards. So we need to be the ones telling people about the beauty of married love and about sex. So what should sex be? Well, these are some suggestions at least. Include some mutual submissiveness. That's based on 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 5. It should be something that brings pleasure. That's from the Song of Songs. It should focus on relationship. 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 4. It's not just having sex. It's something that is shared between a husband and a wife. Be exclusive, of course, Hebrews 13 and verse 4. Susan Nelson gives these tips for sexual pleasure in marriage. Be pure, and that doesn't mean just physically, but mentally. Be pure when it comes to relationship with your spouse. Understand each other's needs. Wives should embrace their sexuality. Again, we're kind of stereotyping, but sometimes the problem is, as I've counseled couples, is that wives tell me, well, I just don't feel that desirable. Well, your husband does. So it doesn't matter how you feel, understand how he feels about you. Oops, I don't know what I did there. There we go. Hit the wrong button. We'll try that again. Number 4, husbands should embrace romance. Well, I'm just not romantic. Well, why not? Do you love your wife? I preached last year here about apologetics, and I talked about, I know some of you don't like science and you don't like history. Do you like your kids? If you do, you better know some things. Well, I'm not very romantic. Do you like your wife? Do you like being married? You better learn. And you can learn to be romantic, so embrace that. Learn to talk openly with each other about sex. Even between husbands and wives, sometimes that's difficult. And learn to experiment and do things differently. Here's from that book, Date Your Wife. He's talking about a woman wrote him this letter where she said, I thought you might be interested to know, I went to a mom's homeschooling meeting last week. The topic was intimacy with your husband. 3 different ladies presented on the importance of having regular sex with your husband. 3-day rule, never go 3 days without having sex. And 2 times a week rule, having sex at least 2 times a week. They all had experience and research to support how it benefits the entire family and change one family from almost divorced to happy as can be. Now, he shows this to his wife, and his wife writes the response. And she said, this is his wife speaking, he said, my wife said, personally, I think the 2 times a week rule and 3-day rule isn't frequent enough. I think aiming for every other day, which would be 4 times a week, is a healthier range, but I guess the question our husbands can best answer, since they typically have the bigger sex tank. And we definitely don't want to send them out into this sex-crazed world with their sex tanks on low. Satan's prowling. One other brief thought is that when I'm aiming for 4 times a week, that doesn't have to be roses, chocolate, and lingerie encounters every time. That's what his wife wrote. And after he told us what his wife wrote in the book, here's his next line. Man, I love my wife. That's what it's about. It's about fulfilling the needs. It's about the intimacy you have. It's about the connection that you have. So foster emotional intimacy, because sex is about more than just sex. There's these stages of intimacy, the honeymoon phase and the raising a family phase and the empty nesters phase, and whatever phase you're in. You can do things that will help you grow in your intimacy when it comes to your physical relationship with each other. There's roadblocks that are out there, to be sure. Your career and your family is going to try to steal your time, wear you out, make you tired to where it's just easy to not focus on it. But you have to make yourself focus on it. Relational hurt. Sometimes I don't feel like making love because we've been arguing and fussing and fighting all day. Maybe that's what we need to do after we've been fussing and fighting all day, to reconnect with each other. Number 3, that inequality. Sometimes that as she talked about, maybe one of you has a lower sex drive and someone has a higher sex drive, or vice versa. And typically maybe that's the man, but it doesn't always have to be the case. But understanding that will help you to remove that roadblock. Sometimes we don't like to talk about it because it's sinful. In fact, I'll be honest, when I'm preaching, sometimes when I'm preaching about this, I want to say, and we're talking today about sex. You know, because you don't want to say it out loud. It's not a sinful thing. It's like everything else that God created. It's beautiful and perfect and wonderful, and we've messed it up. But if we get back to His way, it'd be a wonderful, beautiful thing. So real quick, some suggestions, and we'll go through these real quickly. Increase your intimacy with each other. Identify your needs and your spouse's needs so you can fulfill those needs. Make an effort. Sometimes that's all it takes in order to increase the happiness you have with your sex life with your spouse, is for just to make the effort to try. Schedule a date night with each other. Get a babysitter, or tell the kids to go order some pizza. We're going out to a nice restaurant and eat some food that we can afford when we carry you along. And open the door for her and pull the chair out and do those kinds of things. Take charge. Don't wait for her to make the first move every time. Don't wait for him to make the first move every time. You know what drives a husband crazy more than anything? Is if his wife is the one that initiates making love. He's like, well, she must really like me. And husbands, guess what drives your wife crazy? When you initiate making love. And sometimes it's because she's thinking, oh boy. But no, most of the time it's he really likes me. You need to understand that what you can do for each other. Change your pattern of initiating sex. Hold hands with each other. Flirt with each other. Allow tension to build through the day before you get to bedtime. Separate sexual intimacy from your routine. Don't go to the bedroom talking about how that you're not sure how you're going to pay the house or bills, or you need a new water pump on your previously lived in BMW, or whatever it might be. Instead, that's our safe zone where we're talking about our relationship and suiting each other. Be desirable. Make yourself desirable for your spouse and communicate, but only with each other. Don't be talking to mom and daddy or brother and sister or your guy friends or your girlfriends about that. Schedule time with each other. Be emotionally vulnerable. Make sex a priority in your marriage, because your spouse is worth pursuing. Spiritually, emotionally, physically. I think I was in the shadow for a moment. I think now I just realize I've gone over, and so I really apologize for that. But I hope you see there's lots of things that you can do to help your marriage and your spouse if you realize the importance of pursuing your spouse. You can keep that fire burning. And here's why that's so important. Because among the many ways that the Lord describes our relationship that we have between us and Jesus is in Ephesians chapter 5. He says it's just like the relationship between a husband and a wife. Now, at the end of that, he says this is a mystery because I'm talking to you about the church. And what we usually do with that text is we talk about marriage. Maybe the Ephesians understood marriage, but they didn't understand how relationship with Jesus and the church worked. But we've gotten to write the opposite. Wouldn't it be a shame if someone who knew Ephesians chapter 5 saw me and my spouse and said, if that's what it looks like, I'm out. But what an example and what a light we can be in our communities, in our churches, in the kingdom, whenever the love that a husband and wife shares reflects the love between Jesus and His church. Whenever that relationship points people to Him. When we choose to use our homes to honor and glorify the name of the Lord, what an impact we can have. Thank you for your attention.